Destination Mark.
Hey guys, how's it going? Marcelo here, and I already know ahead of time this is a weird opinion to have. I just hope it isn't too controversial. The Spyro games are renowned for their gameplay. Being able to torch enemies, charge to get around faster, and glide long distances is always amazing. The levels Spyro traverses through are usually designed very well, perfectly complementing these abilities. And among all the unique types of enemies the little dragon faces, the most interesting ones to me are the bosses. If the gameplay in your platformer is great, then I expect the bosses to help elevate that further, and in Spyro 1's case, that is in fact the truth. Most people see Spyro 1's bosses as nothing more than giant, bland, glorified enemies, and I heavily disagree with that. Sure, most of them are taken down pretty easily and don't even need a health bar, but it's the fact that each one has their own level dedicated to them that I feel makes the first game stand out in its approach to boss fights. You're not just restricted to a generic circular arena where you're waiting for cycles before attacking, you're traveling through perilous areas that test you on your knowledge of that particular homeworld, and are even introduced to some totally unique enemies that you'll never find anywhere else. All while you either chase the boss down or work to cut off their power supply even while they're in a cycle of attack. And some of these unique enemies will certainly test your skills. The dogs and Toasty will remind you of your roll ability very quickly, and the pansies and armored horrors from Jock Stage will ask of you to flame and charge them atop small pedestals, testing your precise platforming. Add in the fact that only 2 of the 6 boss levels contain fodder, and you've got some tough yet rewarding boss fights on your hands. So where's the problem I spoke of in the title? Well, as you may have guessed, that wouldn't come until the very next game, where they did the exact thing I mentioned Spyro 1 didn't do. You're placed in a generic circular arena, dodging attack cycles while waiting for your opening. In Spyro 2, you only face off against 3 bosses: Crush, Gulp, and Ripto. As such, each fight arguably does feel bigger in stakes and tougher in difficulty than the last. Ask anyone though, Gulp is just bullshit, straight up. Whether it's the original or Reignited, you'd be hard-pressed to find someone out there who genuinely likes this fight. And while Ripto's first 2 phases aren't anything particularly lavish, the final phase throws us into an interesting scenario. Upon absorbing special powers from the orbs, Spyro gets to freely fly around and shoot Super Flame fireballs at Ripto. Sure, the camera and Ripto's constant movement can be a bit annoying, but the idea of a flying boss fight while controlling, a dragon, is really cool. But I'll hold my tongue for now when it comes to main villain fights. We'll get there in a sec. By Spyro 3, this method of fighting bosses would become the norm, and at that point, I personally stopped caring about them. Somehow, Spyro 3 manages to build up the intensity of the bosses by showing us how they were created, and then the fight is just boring, or bland, or bullshit! I'm sorry, Miharu, I know you like Scorch and everything, but I can't stand that motherfucker! Anyway, here's where the problem really starts to arise for me. The bosses just aren't very good. Insomniac unfortunately dropped their unique approach to how the player discovered and fought the bosses while being tested on their skills in favor of what was just the norm for boss fights. Which leads me to my next point: the setups aren't clever, or are just non-existent. When I was a kid, it was the coolest thing, watching the giant dragon head open its mouth to reveal Toasty's stage after I'd saved enough dragons. Getting to fight the boss was an honor you had to earn, and even though the other homeworlds apart from Nasty's just mingle the other boss portals in with the regular levels, it isn't fully advisable for a new player to just go and fight them immediately. It's worth checking out the other levels first, so you're more properly prepared to deal with the boss. In Spyro 2, you see all 3 baddies right away, but again, the arenas don't really set you up for anything necessarily harrowing. You're just waiting on cycles or an opportunity to get the weapon you need. In Spyro 3, we're pretty much exclusively waiting on cycles. Even the mini-bosses Bluto and Sleepyhead aren't very engaging. And because Spyro has little to absolutely no attachment to or prior knowledge of the Sorceress, Bianca, or any of the threats ahead, we get no cutscenes of Spyro interacting or taunting them. Besides Bianca, that is. But in terms of bosses, there's no relationship there at all. So you're looking forward to nothing but ridding yourself of them so you can move on. They feel like more of a nuisance than a genuine roadblock you need to overcome. And speaking of disappointments, let's get on with those main villains. Nasty Nork, I like, because the opening cutscene and instruction manual, remember when those contain lore, all clearly show that there's bad blood between the Norks and the dragons. So Nasty getting the idea to crystallize them didn't just come from nowhere. From the beginning, Spyro's goal was clear, and even though he didn't have any back and forth with the bosses in the first game either, the dragons he saves provide hints and tips into exploiting their weak spots. And again, the levels are just so interesting and engaging all on their own. Nasty's fight is really good too, chasing down thieves, unlocking more parts of the level, avoiding Nasty's crystallizing blasts, and then chasing the Nork through a hellish platforming gauntlet. It's a great conclusion to a great game. Ripto, I feel, gets more hate than he deserves. To this day, I keep hearing fans say that Ripto's a lazy villain, he doesn't do anything. But if you, again, pay attention to the story, you'd know that there's a small week-long time skip between the flashback where Elora explains Ripto's arrival and the proper beginning of the game when the trio brings Spyro into Avalar. So in that time, the villains rampage throughout the homeworlds, turning factions against one another, generally causing mischief, and overtaking the lands for themselves. By now, you should all be familiar with the cut dialogue from Elora that would have played during the opening cutscenes for each level, in which she details such things. These conversations even stayed in the Japanese version of the game. Couple that with the constant banter between Spyro and Ripto, and you have one of the greatest rivalries in the series. I already talked about his boss fight, and because of it, I'd love to see more flying boss battles in the future. The Sorceress is the worst villain of the trilogy, in my opinion. Talk about a villain who does nothing. After Bianca flashbacks to her sending the dragons away, she just sits on her throne and makes Bianca do all her dirty work. She's loud, annoying, and when her secret plan of getting immortality is revealed, she just suddenly gets really dark out of nowhere. I think it's safe to say her writing and portrayal are all over the place. And her first boss fight, good god, is it annoying as hell. Take everything I don't like about Spyro 3 and mash it all into one aggravating package, and you get this. A bland, boring arena, cycles you have to wait on, vehicles that control like utter ass, and the worst part of all, again, there's no banter. Like I said before, Spyro has no affiliation with anyone here, so it's like Spyro 2, but worse. Spyro and the Sorceress get no time on screen together before this fight, so in all ways imaginable, the Sorceress is the complete opposite of Ripto. And there it is. My problem with Spyro bosses is that they had something really great and, once more, unique at the start, but must have gotten feedback that it felt too boring or too empty or whatever y'all complain about regarding Spyro 1, and figured narrowing the focus down to a one-on-one fight in an arena was the better option. But to me, it wasn't. I loved going through the boss levels. I loved learning how to deal with the unique enemies, and I loved that each boss had something different about him that you had to exploit. It all reinforces Spyro 1's theme of exploration and growth. The second and third games went the way of their contemporaries and scaled the fights down, and that in turn made them really boring, aggravating, basic, safe, not engaging. What I'd personally like to see are boss fights that feel experimental and bigger like Spyro 1's. Funnily enough, I sort of got a bit of that in Spyro A Hero's Tale. I just finished playing it on stream not too long ago, and after getting a little annoyed at Red's first fight, which yes is in an arena, I then thought it was actually a sort of neat idea to restrict some moves or movement in order to utilize other abilities in your toolkit that you may have forgotten you had. Spyro bosses don't need to be Elden Ring scaled. I'm not asking for more difficult boss fights, I'm asking for more engaging ones. Just like how I want a new Spyro game to utilize the dragon's moves and breaths in interesting and creative ways, I want the bosses to return to that Spyro 1 style of big, enthralling, and unique, back in their own levels that are designed tightly with the intent on testing the player and providing them an incredible experience. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to see more Spyro videos, don't forget to subscribe, like the vid, and hit the bell, and I'll see you all next time. Until then, I'm Mark, and take care.